day no didn't end. Anything. She said no the way she had learned to say no. Soft around the edges, with timing, with consideration, with an explanation already forming behind it like a cushion placed carefully so no one would feel the impact. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't loud. It wasn't even final. It was a sentence that came out of her mouth and immediately began asking for permission to exist. The moment passed. The other person nodded. Maybe they said they understood. Maybe they smiled. On the surface, it looked settled, but inside her day, something quietly shifted. Not because she had refused, but because the refusal didn't end anything. The explanations began almost instantly, not always spoken out loud. Sometimes they lived in text messages, typed and erased, then typed again. Sometimes they showed up in her tone lighter than usual, careful not to sound sharp. Sometimes they came later hours after the decision dropped casually into conversation, as if to say, see, I'm still the same person, I'm still good, I still care. She told herself this was just being thoughtful. She had always been thoughtful. That was the word people used, considerate, reliable, easy to talk to, the one who understood, the one who didn't make things awkward, the one who knew how to smooth the moment when it might otherwise tighten. This was how she had learned to move through the world. She didn't announce herself. She adjusted. She read the room before she spoke. She learned early how much easier life was when people didn't have to work around her needs. When she made herself flexible. When she could anticipate disappointment before it happened and quietly rearrange herself so it never had to land. Saying no had never been her language, or rather it had always come with subtitles. She would say no, but then she would say why, and then she would say, sorry, and then she would add a promise for later, and then she would offer something else in its place, as if a simple boundary were a debt that needed immediate repayment. She didn't notice when this started. Most people don't. It doesn't arrive as a rule, it arrives as praise. You're so easy, you're so understanding, you're so kind. And slowly, without anyone ever saying it, directly being good, becomes a role you wear without questioning whether it still fits. The role works. That's the problem. It keeps things running. It keeps relationships intact. It keeps the air calm. It keeps her included. And over time, it becomes hard to tell where the role ends and where she begins. Not because anyone forced it on her, but because it was rewarded in small, consistent ways. This time, though, something felt different. Not wrong, just heavier. The no itself had been clean, honest, even necessary. But what followed felt familiar in a way that made her tired before she could name why. The way she checked her phone to see if the other person had responded differently. The way she replayed the moment, adjusting her tone in her memory, wondering if she should have said it another way. The way she began preparing future explanations for a decision that had already been made. It was as if the no had opened a door she wasn't used to walking through, and instead of stepping forward, she stood in the doorway turning back to reassure everyone that the house was still standing. This wasn't the first time. It had happened with family, with partners, with friends, with work. Different faces, same pattern. She could trace it through her life if she tried. The holiday she attended, even though she was exhausted because it would mean so much to them. The relationship she stayed in longer than she should have because leaving would hurt someone who wasn't a bad person. The extra responsibility she accepted because she was capable, even when capable, had started to feel like a trap. None of these moments were crises. That was the strange part. There was no clear villain, no obvious injustice, just a steady accumulation of small choices where she stayed understandable and others stayed comfortable. She had learned to live slightly ahead of other people's reactions, to preempt disappointment, to soften edges before they cut, to keep harmony intact by managing herself first. It looked like maturity. It sounded like kindness. It felt like being an adult. But lately, something inside her had begun to notice the cost. Not loudly, not dramatically. Just as a quiet accounting that happened when she was alone, when the day slowed down and there was no one left to reassure. When she realized how much energy had gone into making a single decision acceptable to everyone else. She didn't resent anyone in particular. That would have been easier. Resentment gives you a target. What she felt instead was a dull recognition, a sense that she was spending more time explaining herself than actually living the decision she had made. There is a part of every woman who learns how to wear herself for the world, how to present a version that fits. That part is not fake, it is functional. It knows how to survive, how to belong, how to stay connected. It knows the rules. It knows when to speak and when to stay quiet. It knows how to be agreeable without disappearing completely. But there is another part that watches. It notices patterns. It remembers moments that didn't quite land right. It doesn't shout. It doesn't demand. It simply keeps track. That watching part had been awake all day, watching her explain, watching her soften, watching her work to restore balance after a decision that shouldn't have required cleanup. It wasn't judging her. It wasn't offering advice. It was just there, steady, present, noticing. As the day went on, she began to see how automatic the habit was, how quickly her mouth moved to fill silence, how naturally she reached for reassurance when no one had asked for it, how uncomfortable it felt to let a decision stand without commentary. She wondered briefly what would happen if she didn't explain. The thought didn't last long. It felt impractical, risky, rude maybe. She had spent years learning that silence could be misread, that clarity without cushioning could be taken as cold, that saying less sometimes made people assume more. So she kept doing what she had always done. She adjusted, she clarified, she reassured. She stayed kind. And yet underneath it all, the watching part remained, not louder, just more present. It noticed the difference between the no she had spoken and the way she had spent the rest of the day undoing it. It noticed how being good had once protected her and how now it seemed to require constant maintenance. This was not a moment of realization, not a turning point. Nothing resolved itself. It was simply a moment where something familiar was seen from a slightly different angle, where a habit revealed its shape. She didn't know what it meant yet. She didn't need to. The story was not finished. It had barely begun. All she knew was that the no had been honest and the explanations had been exhausting. And somewhere between the two, a quiet question had taken root without asking for an answer. The day ended the way most days do, with ordinary tasks, with messages replied to, with routines resumed. From the outside, nothing had changed. But inside, something had shifted just enough to be noticed again later. And that was how it stayed, unresolved, unannounced, present. Not as a problem to fix, not as a lesson to learn, but as a tension that would not go away simply because she was good at keeping everything else together. The explanations begin. The explanations didn't arrive all at once. They slipped in between other things. A message sent while waiting in line, a follow-up call framed as checking in, a casual sentence added at the end of something unrelated, each one small enough to seem harmless. Together they filled the day. She noticed how naturally they came, almost reflexive, as if the moment she chose herself, a second part of her stepped forward to make sure no one felt left behind. She didn't plan them. She didn't sit down and decide to explain. Her body already knew the choreography, the timing, the tone, the exact amount of detail that would signal care without inviting further questions. This was not new territory. She had walked this path so many times it barely registered as movement. She could do it while thinking about something else, while driving, while cooking, while answering emails. The explanations layered themselves over her life like background noise, always present, rarely examined. What changed was not the behavior. It was the noticing. She caught herself mid-sentence once offering context that hadn't been asked for. She paused just long enough to realize she was still trying to manage the outcome of a decision that had already been accepted. The pause was brief. No one else would have seen it, but she felt it. A tiny hesitation, like missing a step on familiar stairs. She wondered who the explanations were for, not in a philosophical way, just practically. The other person hadn't pushed back. They hadn't expressed disappointment. They hadn't questioned her reasons. And yet, she kept supplying them as if there were an invisible audience still waiting to be convinced. It occurred to her that she had always lived with that audience, an imagined presence that kept track, that measured her against a standard she had absorbed so early she could no longer locate its source. It wasn't a voice. It didn't speak in words. It showed up as a feeling in her chest when she considered doing something that might inconvenience someone else. She had learned how to quiet that feeling by explaining, by reassuring, by offering proof that she was still the same person, that she hadn't suddenly become difficult or distant or less caring than she had been before. There was a strange comfort in the explanations. They restored order. They smoothed the space between her and others. They reestablished her place. When she explained, she could feel the tension ease, even if no one had been tense to begin with. It was like straightening a picture frame that no one else had noticed was crooked. But comfort has a cost. She felt it in the way her shoulders stayed tight long after the conversations ended, in the way her mind kept returning to the same moment, replaying it from different angles, checking for damage, in the way her own day seemed to shrink around the effort of maintaining equilibrium. She began to see how much of her life had been shaped by this quiet work, how often she had preemptively adjusted so others wouldn't have to, how many times she had explained herself into exhaustion just to avoid being misunderstood, how rarely she had let a decision stand without escorting it with reasons. There was a time when this skill had been praised. She remembered that. Adults calling her mature, friends calling her thoughtful, partners calling her easy to be with. Those words had settled into her bones. They had become a kind of identity she carried with pride. Being good had meant being aware. It had meant paying attention. It had meant not surprising people with sharp edges. It had meant understanding before being understood. For a long time, it had worked. It had kept her safe. It had kept her connected. But something about this moment felt heavier. Not because the stakes were higher, but because the pattern was too familiar. She could see it now, laid out in front of her like a path worn smooth by repetition. She thought about all the times she had chosen the explanation over the silence, the times she had offered reasons instead of letting a no be complete, the times she had felt a flicker of irritation at having to justify herself, then quickly smothered it with patience. That irritation had always been inconvenient. It didn't fit the role she knew how to play. It raised questions she didn't have time to answer, so she had learned to redirect it to translate it into something more acceptable. She told herself she was just being considerate, that it was better this way, that clarity prevented conflict. But clarity had started to feel like a one-way street. She noticed how rarely the explanations went in the other direction, how seldom others felt the need to justify their choices to her. They didn't announce their boundaries with apologies. They didn't cushion their decisions with promises. They simply stated what they would do, and the world adjusted. This wasn't a grievance. She wasn't keeping score. It was just an observation that sat with her longer than she expected. She remembered being younger, learning how quickly things could shift if she disappointed someone, how the room could cool, how the tone could change, how silence could stretch. She had learned to read those shifts like weather patterns to adjust before the storm arrived. That skill had never left her. It had matured, refined itself, disguised itself as competence. But it was still there, alert, ready to intervene whenever she stepped slightly out of line. The explanations were its language. As the day went on, she tried something small. She let one moment pass without filling it. A pause at the end of a conversation where she would normally add context. The silence felt louder than it was. She felt the familiar urge rise, the impulse to smooth, to clarify, to make sure everything was okay. Nothing happened. The conversation ended. The world didn't collapse. No one seemed offended. The moment moved on. The relief was brief, followed immediately by discomfort. Not relief in the sense of triumph, but a strange exposure. As if she had stepped outside without a coat she usually wore without thinking. The air felt sharper, more direct. She didn't know what to make of that feeling. She didn't assign meaning to it. She simply noticed it the same way she had begun noticing everything else. The explanations continued. Old habits don't disappear in a day, but now each one carried a faint echo of awareness. She could feel the difference between when she was speaking to be understood and when she was speaking to be approved. That distinction had never been clear before. It hovered just beneath the surface, not fully formed, but present enough to change the texture of the moment. She wondered how many of her choices had been shaped by the anticipation of explanation. How often she had avoided certain paths simply because she didn't want to have to justify them. How much of her life had been organized around what would be easiest to explain. The thought lingered unfinished. There was no accusation in it, no demand, just a quiet curiosity that refused to be dismissed. By evening, she felt tired in a way that sleep wouldn't fix. Not physically exhausted, something else. A fatigue that came from holding too many things at once, from being both the one who chose and the one who managed the reaction to that choice. She sat alone for a moment and let the day settle. The messages were answered. The conversations were done. Everything was fine. And yet the watching part of her was still there, steady as ever. It didn't rush her. It didn't tell her what to do next. It simply held the question open. What if the explanation was no longer serving the purpose she thought it was? She didn't answer that. She wasn't ready to. The question didn't need an answer yet. It only needed space. As she moved through the evening, she felt the shape of that space inside her. Unfamiliar, slightly uncomfortable. Not empty, but unoccupied. A place where something had always rushed in to fill the gap now left momentarily untouched. She sensed without naming it that this was not about a single decision or a single day. It was about a way of being that had carried her far and was now asking to be seen more clearly. The explanations would return tomorrow. She knew that. They had a long history together, but so would the watching. And now that it had begun, it didn't seem inclined to go back to sleep. The story was still unfolding. Nothing had been resolved. Nothing had been declared. Only this quiet shift, this subtle change in how she occupied her own choices, this growing awareness that saying no was one thing and living with that no was something else entirely. And somewhere in that difference, something waited. How being good has always worked. There was a time when being good felt like safety. Not the dramatic kind, but the steady kind that keeps doors open and conversations smooth. It meant she knew what to do in most situations, how to respond, how to anticipate, how to make herself easy to be around. It gave her a role that fit one she could step into without thinking. She learned early that being good wasn't about perfection. It was about awareness, about noticing what others needed before they asked, about adjusting her pace to match the room, about choosing the option that caused the least friction. None of this felt forced. It felt natural. It felt like maturity. And it worked. Teachers trusted her. Friends leaned on her. Partners relaxed around her. She became the person people could count on, the one who didn't complicate things, the one who understood. When she showed up, the temperature of the room stayed even. When she spoke, she didn't escalate. When there was tension, she absorbed it quietly, like that was simply part of the arrangement. She didn't think of this as sacrifice. It didn't feel heavy back then. It felt like competence, like being someone who knew how to move through the world without making unnecessary noise. There was pride in that, a quiet confidence in knowing she could handle herself. Being good had rules, even if no one ever spelled them out. You don't inconvenience people if you can avoid it. You don't ask for more than necessary. You don't make others feel uncomfortable with your needs. You don't create problems where there don't need to be any. You stay flexible. You stay gracious. You stay reasonable. She followed these rules without resentment because they rewarded her. They kept her included. They kept her liked. They kept her connected. They made her feel like she belonged. Over time, the rules became habits. The habits became instinct, and instinct stopped asking questions. She didn't remember deciding to be this way. It felt like something she had always known how to do the same way. You know how to keep your balance when walking. It wasn't conscious, it was embodied. Her body knew when to lean in and when to pull back. Her voice knew when to soften. Her mind knew how to translate what she wanted into something easier for others to accept. This is how being good worked. It moved ahead of discomfort. It prevented scenes. It kept relationships intact. It made life manageable. But habits don't announce when they stop serving you. They don't sound alarms. They just keep going, doing what they've always done, even when the conditions have changed. Lately, she had begun to notice the edges of the role, not because something went wrong, but because something felt off. A subtle mismatch between what she did automatically and what she actually wanted in certain moments. The gap was small but persistent. She could feel it when she agreed to something and immediately felt a tightening, not because the thing itself was difficult, but because saying yes had required her to step slightly away from herself. She could feel it when she explained a choice that didn't need explaining. She could feel it when she smiled out of habit, even when the smile arrived a beat too late. Being good had always helped her navigate other people, but now it seemed to be interfering with how she navigated herself. She began to see how often she filtered her reactions before they reached the surface, how quickly she assessed whether something was worth mentioning, how often she chose silence not because she had nothing to say, but because saying it would require more energy than she wanted to spend managing the response. This filtering wasn't dishonest. It was efficient. It kept things moving. It avoided misunderstandings. It protected relationships from unnecessary strain. But it also meant that parts of her experience never made it into the room. She thought about the times she had adjusted her preferences because they were inconvenient. The times she had downplayed what mattered to her because it didn't align with what others expected. The times she had chosen the easier version of herself because it fit better into existing arrangements. None of this had been dramatic. That was the problem. There was no single moment she could point to and say, "That's when it happened." It was 1,000 small choices, each one reasonable on its own. Being good had taught her how to belong, but it hadn't taught her how to stay. She noticed how often she became the bridge between people, the one who translated, who smoothed, who made sense of things so others didn't have to sit with discomfort. She could feel when tension entered a space, and she moved instinctively to resolve it sometimes before anyone else even acknowledged it. This ability had been useful. It had made her valuable. But value can become expectation, and expectation can quietly harden into obligation. She wondered when being good had stopped feeling like a choice and started feeling like a requirement. There were moments when she imagined doing things differently, letting a pause stretch, saying less, allowing others to feel what they felt without stepping in to manage it. These moments were fleeting. They didn't last long. They were interrupted by the familiar urge to restore balance. Being good didn't like uncertainty. It preferred clarity. It preferred resolution. It preferred to close the loop. And yet she was beginning to sense that some loops weren't meant to be closed immediately, that some questions needed to remain open longer than was comfortable. She thought about the people in her life who didn't seem to carry this same weight, who made decisions without rehearsing explanations, who said no and moved on. They weren't unkind. They weren't careless. They simply didn't seem to feel responsible for everyone else's reaction. This wasn't admiration or envy. It was curiosity. She began to ask herself not why she was this way, but how it had worked so well for so long. How being good had protected her, shaped her, given her a place, and how that same structure might now be limiting the space she had to move. There was a strange loyalty she felt toward this version of herself. Being good had been there for her. It had kept her safe in rooms where she didn't feel entirely secure. It had given her a script when she wasn't sure what to say. It had helped her navigate expectations without conflict. Questioning it felt almost like betrayal. And yet loyalty doesn't disappear just because something no longer fits. It lingers. It complicates. It makes change feel heavier than it might otherwise be. She noticed how often she measured her actions against how they would be received, how she evaluated herself through imagined reactions, how she anticipated disappointment before it had a chance to form. This anticipation shaped her behavior more than she realized. It guided her choices, quietly steering her toward what would be easiest to explain, easiest to accept, easiest to maintain. Being good had taught her how to manage outcomes, but it hadn't taught her how to tolerate disapproval or misunderstanding, or the discomfort of being seen differently than she intended. She wasn't sure she knew how to live without the buffer. The thought didn't frighten her. It unsettled her. There was a difference. Fear had an edge to it. This felt more like stepping into unfamiliar weather without knowing how long it would last. She began to see how often she apologized without needing to, how frequently she softened statements that were already reasonable, how instinctively she took responsibility for the emotional temperature of a room even when it wasn't hers to manage. These were small things, easily dismissed, easily justified, but together they formed a pattern she could no longer ignore. Being good had once given her a sense of control. Now it felt like something she had to maintain. She wasn't angry about this. She wasn't ready to reject the role. She simply couldn't unsee it anymore. As the day moved forward, she found herself noticing the moments when she slipped back into old rhythms. The quick reassurance, the explanatory aside, the reflexive check-in. Each time she felt the familiarity of it, the ease, and beneath that, the faint awareness of a choice being made. This awareness didn't change her behavior yet, it just accompanied it. She realized that being good had always worked because it kept her predictable, it made her reliable, it made her someone others didn't have to worry about. There was comfort in that predictability for everyone involved, but predictability has a cost. It can flatten the edges of who you are. It can make you easier to manage, but harder to know. She wondered what parts of herself had been quietly set aside because they didn't fit the role, not erased, just unused. Waiting. This wasn't about becoming someone else. It wasn't about rejecting kindness or consideration. It was about seeing the full shape of the habit she had been living inside. Being good had always worked. That was undeniable. The question that hovered now, unspoken but persistent, was whether working was the same as being alive. She didn't answer that. She let it sit. The role remained. She still knew how to play it, but something in her had shifted just enough to make it feel slightly heavier, slightly less invisible. And once something becomes visible, it rarely returns to its original place. The day ended quietly without resolution. She didn't confront anyone. She didn't make declarations. She didn't change her life. She simply carried this new awareness with her like a weight she had always borne, now finally felt. Being good had shaped her path. That much was clear. Where it would lead her next was not. The quiet accounting. The day didn't change much on the surface. She still answered messages. She still showed up where she was expected. She still spoke in the same measured way that kept things moving. But underneath all of that, something had begun to tally itself quietly without judgment. It happened in the pauses between things. When she closed one conversation and moved on to the next. When she finished an obligation and felt the brief emptiness before filling it with another. In those small gaps, she noticed what stayed with her and what drained away. She began to register how often she left interactions slightly diminished, not upset, not angry, just smaller, as if a portion of her attention had been spent maintaining something that wasn't entirely mutual. She could feel it in her body, the subtle slump that came after too much accommodation, the way her breath shortened when she realized she had once again adjusted without being asked. This was not a dramatic reckoning. There were no lists, no decisions, just a growing awareness that every choice carried a weight and that weight accumulated over time. She noticed how often she took on responsibility that no one had assigned her, the responsibility to keep conversations comfortable, the responsibility to prevent disappointment, the responsibility to ensure that no one misread her intentions. These responsibilities were invisible, which made them easy to accept and hard to put down. They followed her everywhere, into work where she framed requests as favors, into family where she downplayed her limits, into friendships where she listened longer than she spoke. Each setting had its own version of the same expectation, and she met it without protest because she always had. What changed was not the expectation, but her awareness of it. She began to sense how much mental energy went into preparing herself for other people's reactions, how often she rehearsed explanations in advance, how rarely she allowed herself to act without calculating the aftermath. This preparation was constant background work she had never named before. It felt like carrying a ledger she had never agreed to keep. The ledger didn't measure right or wrong. It tracked effort. It recorded how much of herself she gave in moments where she could have remained neutral. It counted the times she absorbed discomfort that wasn't hers to hold. She thought about the no she had spoken days earlier, how clean it had felt, how quickly it had been surrounded by justification, how much time she had spent making that single decision palatable. The cost wasn't obvious in the moment. It revealed itself later in fatigue that didn't have a clear source, in irritation that seemed to arrive without warning, in a vague sense that her days were full, yet something essential remained untouched. She realized how often she postponed her own needs because attending to them would require explanation, how frequently she chose the path that demanded the least justification even if it demanded more from her. This wasn't martyrdom. She didn't see herself as sacrificing. That language felt too dramatic. It was simply efficiency. It was easier to adjust herself than to disrupt the flow of things. But efficiency has consequences when applied without limits. She noticed how rarely she asked herself whether she wanted something before considering how it would affect others. The question of desire came second, sometimes third, sometimes not at all. This wasn't because she didn't know what she wanted. It was because acknowledging it felt like opening a negotiation she didn't want to manage. There was a part of her that equated ease with goodness. If something went smoothly, it must have been the right choice. If no one was upset, it must have been fair. This logic had guided her for years, quietly shaping her decisions. Now she began to see the flaw in it. Smoothness did not necessarily mean balance. Silence did not necessarily mean agreement. And peace could be maintained at the expense of someone who had learned not to speak too loudly. She didn't blame anyone for this. No one had demanded she live this way. The pattern was old, reinforced by countless interactions where her adaptability had been rewarded. Still, the accounting continued. She began to notice moments when she felt a flicker of resistance quickly overridden, a tightening when she agreed too quickly, a hesitation when she heard herself say yes without checking in. These signals were subtle, easy to dismiss. But once noticed, they were hard to ignore. They didn't accuse her. They didn't insist. They simply marked a discrepancy between what she did and what she would have done if no explanation were required. She thought about how rarely she let herself be inconvenient, how much effort she put into remaining agreeable, how uncomfortable the idea of disappointing someone felt even when the disappointment would be brief and manageable. Discomfort had become something she avoided, not because it was unbearable, but because she had learned she was responsible for preventing it. This responsibility shaped her more than she realized. It influenced how she spoke, how she planned, how she imagined her future. It narrowed the range of what felt possible, not through restriction, but through anticipation. The accounting revealed something else too. The moments when she didn't explain, when she let a decision stand, when she allowed silence to do its work. These moments were rare, but when they happened, she felt a strange mix of relief and unease. Relief at not having to manage the outcome. Unease at not knowing how she was being perceived. Being seen had always mattered to her. Not in the sense of attention, but in the sense of being understood as kind, reasonable good. The idea of being misunderstood unsettled her more than conflict itself. The ledger recorded that too. As she moved through her days, she noticed how much of her identity was tied to predictability. People knew what to expect from her. She liked that. It made interactions simpler. But it also meant that deviations felt larger than they were. A small boundary could feel like a rupture. A simple no could feel like a statement about who she was becoming. The accounting didn't demand change. It didn't suggest solutions. It simply laid the facts out plainly without commentary. Here is how much you give. Here is how often you adjust. Here is how rarely you let things rest without explanation. She carried this awareness quietly. She didn't share it. She didn't analyze it aloud. It was too raw, too undefined. Naming it might have forced it into something premature. Instead, she let it accompany her like a presence walking beside her, rather than a voice directing her. She began to feel the difference between generosity and obligation, between care and maintenance, between kindness and the fear of being seen differently. These distinctions had always existed. She just hadn't needed them before. The quiet accounting continued day after day. It didn't accuse, it didn't conclude. It simply counted. And in the counting, she began to sense that something in her life was slightly out of balance. Not broken, not wrong, just leaning in one direction for too long. She didn't know yet what it would mean to shift that weight. She wasn't trying to. For now, it was enough to notice that the ledger existed at all. The story was still open, the question still unanswered. But something had been named, if only internally. And once named, even silently, it tends to remain. She went to sleep that night without resolution, without plans, without declarations, only with the quiet knowledge that her life had been costing her something she had never thought to price. And that knowledge, once felt, does not easily fade. When peace starts costing more. She had always thought of peace as something neutral, a baseline, the absence of trouble, the space where things ran smoothly and no one was upset. It was what she worked toward instinctively, what she maintained without thinking. Peace meant the day moved forward without friction. Peace meant she hadn't made anything harder than it needed to be. But lately, peace had begun to feel expensive. Not all at once. Not in a way she could point to and explain. It showed up gradually in the way she felt after yet another moment of smoothing things over. In the way she needed a longer pause before responding to simple questions. In the way her patience thinned, not outwardly, but internally, where no one could see it. She began to notice how often peace depended on her participation, how frequently it was upheld by her willingness to bend first. If she stayed flexible, things stayed calm. If she absorbed the tension, no one else had to feel it. This arrangement had been invisible to her for years because it had worked. It kept conflict at bay. It preserved relationships. It allowed everyone to move on without disruption. But now she could feel the imbalance. Peace was no longer free. It required constant adjustment, constant attentiveness, constant self-editing, and the cost was accumulating quietly without complaint. She felt it when she agreed to something she didn't want to do and immediately began preparing herself for it. Not just logistically, but mentally, bracing, rehearsing, resigning herself. She felt it when she rearranged her schedule so someone else wouldn't be inconvenienced, then felt oddly resentful without knowing who or what the resentment was for. That resentment unsettled her. It didn't fit the image she had of herself. She didn't like the way it crept in uninvited after moments that were supposed to be fine. She tried to dismiss it at first. Everyone gets tired. Everyone needs rest. This wasn't a problem. It was just life. But the feeling persisted, a sense that she was spending more than she was replenishing. That maintaining harmony was beginning to cost her something she hadn't budgeted for. She noticed how often peace meant silence, not the comfortable kind, but the kind that swallowed words before they reached her mouth. The kind that kept thoughts contained because releasing them would complicate things. She had always believed that silence was sometimes the wiser choice, that not everything needed to be said, that restraint was a sign of maturity. But there was a difference between choosing silence and defaulting to it. And lately, silence felt less like a choice and more like a reflex. She began to feel the gap between what she noticed and what she voiced, between what she experienced and what she shared. That gap had grown so gradually she hadn't seen it forming. Peace lived in that gap. So did the cost. She could trace the pattern in her days, the way she listened carefully, offering understanding while quietly setting her own reactions aside, the way she nodded along, agreeing in principle even when something in her resisted, the way she delayed bringing things up because the timing never felt quite right. Timing had become a convenient reason. There was always a better moment, a calmer moment, a moment when everyone would be more receptive. That moment rarely arrived. She noticed how often she prioritized keeping things light, how quickly she shifted the tone when conversations drifted towards something heavier, how instinctively she moved away from subjects that might disrupt the ease she worked so hard to maintain. Ease had become a standard she held herself to, but ease for whom? The question surfaced unexpectedly without accusation. She didn't push it away. She let it sit even though it made her uncomfortable. She realized how often peace was measured by the absence of reaction from others. If no one objected, if no one withdrew, if no one expressed frustration, then everything must be fine. But this measure didn't account for what happened internally after the moment passed. She felt the weight of all the small compromises she had made to keep things running smoothly. None of them dramatic. None of them unreasonable. All of them cumulative. The cost showed up in subtle ways, in a low-grade irritability that followed her through the day, in a sense of distance from herself that was hard to articulate, in the feeling that she was present everywhere and fully present nowhere. She thought about how often she used phrases like, "it's okay" or "it's not a big deal," how frequently she minimized her own reactions to prevent discomfort. These phrases had become part of her vocabulary, spoken so often they barely registered, but words shape reality even when spoken casually. She began to wonder what peace actually meant in her life, whether it was something shared or something she carried alone, whether it was mutual or maintained primarily through her effort. This wasn't about blaming others. It wasn't about deciding who was at fault. It was about noticing the structure she lived inside. Peace, she realized, had been defined as the absence of conflict. But conflict wasn't the only thing that disrupted balance. Neglect could do that too. Silence could do that too. Over time, so could constant accommodation. She noticed how rarely peace included her fully, how often it asked her to stay composed, agreeable, understanding, even when something inside her needed acknowledgement. The thought didn't come with a plan. It didn't demand action. It simply reframed something she had taken for granted. Peace wasn't neutral. It had been shaped, maintained, paid for. She felt this most clearly in moments when she was alone, when there was no one to manage, no one to reassure, no one to adjust for. In those moments, the exhaustion surfaced more plainly, not as a collapse, but as a heaviness that settled in once the performance ended. She realized how rarely she allowed herself to be inconvenient, how deeply she associated inconvenience with disruption and disruption with being difficult. Being difficult was something she avoided at all costs, but at what cost? The question lingered not as a challenge, but as a quiet companion to her thoughts. She began to see that peace had always been easier for others when she did the work, that her role had been to absorb friction so it never reached the surface. This had made her invaluable. It had also made her invisible in certain ways, not unseen, unaccounted for. She didn't know yet what a different version of peace would look like, one that didn't rely so heavily on her self-adjustment. one that included her needs without requiring extensive explanation. She wasn't ready to pursue that version. Not yet. For now, she simply allowed herself to acknowledge the cost, to admit privately that peace had started asking more from her than she could give without consequence. This admission changed nothing outwardly. She still showed up, she still smoothed things over, she still knew how to keep the day running. But something inside her had shifted again slightly, like a weight redistributed. Peace was no longer just the goal. It was a question. And once a question enters even quietly, it has a way of reshaping the space around it. The story remained open, the tension unresolved. But the cost had been noticed, and that noticing carried its own quiet gravity, pulling her attention inward even as the world around her remained unchanged. What gets adjusted? First, when something needed to change, she knew exactly where to start. Not with the situation, not with the request, not with the other person. She started with herself. She adjusted her tone before adjusting the plan. She adjusted her expectations before adjusting her schedule. She adjusted her reactions before adjusting her boundaries. This sequence was so ingrained she rarely noticed it happening. It felt like common sense, like responsibility. If there was tension, she softened. If there was confusion, she clarified. If there was disappointment, she compensated. The first move was always internal. Make it easier, make it smoother, make it less. She could trace this pattern across different areas of her life. At work, she took on extra tasks rather than push back on timelines. In relationships, she adapted her needs to fit the shape of what was already there. In family, she absorbed moods that weren't hers and carried them quietly so gatherings could stay pleasant. Adjustment was her reflex, and it worked. Things kept moving. People stayed comfortable. The surface remained calm, but now she was noticing something else. Every time she adjusted, something inside her shifted slightly out of alignment. Not enough to stop functioning, not enough to draw attention, just enough to be felt later when she was alone. She began to recognize the order of operations in her mind. When a request came in, her first thought wasn't, "Do I want this?" It was, "How do I make this work?" When someone expressed a need, her attention moved immediately to accommodation. Her own position entered the equation later, if at all. This wasn't generosity in the dramatic sense. It was a habit of orientation. Her attention pointed outward by default. She noticed how often she recalibrated herself before anyone else had to adjust, how rarely she allowed others to feel the full weight of their requests, how instinctively she stepped in to bridge gaps that hadn't been acknowledged. This instinct had made her dependable. It had also made her the first thing to be moved when something didn't quite fit. She thought about all the times she had told herself it wasn't worth bringing something up, that it would take too much energy to explain, that it would disrupt the flow, that it would create unnecessary tension. These reasons had always sounded reasonable, sensible, adult, but now she saw how consistently they led to the same outcome. She stayed where she was. She adapted. The situation remained unchanged. What got adjusted first was always her. She noticed this even in small moments, choosing a restaurant, picking a movie, deciding how to spend a free evening. She deferred automatically, not because she didn't have preferences, but because expressing them felt like extra work. It felt simpler to go along. Simple doesn't mean light. Sometimes simple is just familiar. She began to feel the weight of all the micro adjustments she made throughout a day, the slight changes in posture, the careful phrasing, the internal negotiations. None of these were dramatic, but together they formed a steady undercurrent of effort. She wondered when effort had become so quiet, it no longer registered as effort. There were moments when she caught herself mid-adjustment, about to say yes when she meant maybe, about to apologize when no apology was required, about to explain when silence would have been enough. These moments startled her not because she changed course, but because she saw the choice forming before it resolved itself. Seeing the choice didn't automatically alter it. She still adjusted more often than not. Old habits have momentum. But the seeing mattered. It introduced a fraction of space where there had been none. She thought about how much of her identity was tied to being flexible, to being the one who could adapt, to being the one who didn't make things difficult. This identity had been reinforced over time through praise, through relief, through the absence of conflict. If she stopped adjusting, who would she be in the eyes of others? The question didn't feel dramatic. It felt practical. She had built relationships within a certain rhythm. Changing that rhythm would change the dynamic. She wasn't sure she was ready for that. Adjustment had been her way of staying connected, of maintaining closeness without friction, of ensuring that relationships didn't require constant negotiation. But negotiation has a cost too, especially when it happens entirely on one side. She noticed how often she negotiated herself down before any discussion took place, how she trimmed her needs to fit what she assumed was acceptable, how she decided in advance which parts of herself were too much. These decisions were made quickly, efficiently, without conscious deliberation. They felt like instinct. They felt like being considerate. But consideration, she was beginning to realize, had become selective. She considered others constantly, herself less so. This realization didn't come with anger. It came with clarity, a clear-eyed view of a pattern that had been invisible because it was so functional. She thought about the idea of fairness, how often it was defined by balance on the surface rather than balance beneath, how often equality was assumed because no one complained. She had rarely complained. That had been part of her role. She wondered what would happen if she didn't adjust first, if she let the request land fully, if she allowed the other person to sit with their own expectations. The thought made her uncomfortable, not because it was wrong, but because it was unfamiliar. She wasn't used to letting things be slightly uneven. She wasn't used to leaving space unfilled. She wasn't used to not smoothing the edge. Adjustment had been her way of restoring order, of keeping things manageable, of staying good. Now she could see that order had a shape, and she had been shaping herself to fit it for a long time. This awareness didn't make her stop. It made her pause. She began to notice the moments when adjustment felt automatic versus the moments when it felt chosen. The difference was subtle, but it mattered. Automatic adjustments left her tired. Chosen adjustments felt different, lighter, more intentional. She didn't know yet how to choose more often. She wasn't trying to change the pattern overnight. She was still living inside it, but now she could see which part of herself moved first when something needed to give. And seeing that changed the texture of the movement, even if it didn't change the movement itself. The day went on. She adjusted. She accommodated. She smoothed things over. But alongside each adjustment, there was now a quiet recognition. This is what I move first. And once named, even silently, that knowledge lingered. Not as a demand, not as a rebellion, as a presence, waiting. The turning of the habit. The habit didn't break, it didn't shatter, it didn't confront her. It simply reached a point where it could no longer move unnoticed. She still adjusted, she still softened, she still explained. From the outside, nothing about her behavior had dramatically changed, but internally the movement had slowed just enough for her to feel it happen. Before, adjustment had been seamless, automatic. It flowed through her without friction. Now there was a brief moment of resistance each time, like a muscle catching before completing a familiar motion. That resistance wasn't strong. It didn't stop her. It simply made the movement conscious. She noticed it most clearly when someone asked something of her and waited. That small pause, the space before she responded, stretched just a fraction longer than it used to. In that space, she could feel the old reflex rising and something else alongside it. Not a demand, not a command, just awareness. The awareness didn't argue with the habit. It didn't tell her to stop being who she was. It just stood there, watching the exchange unfold. She realized that being good had never been about lying. It had been about timing, about knowing when to speak and when to hold back, about presenting the most acceptable version of herself for the moment at hand. This version was not fake. It was real, practiced, effective. But it wasn't the whole picture. There were parts of her that rarely made it into the room because they didn't move as smoothly. Parts that were slower, less polished, harder to summarize. Parts that didn't come with ready explanations. Those parts had learned to wait. She felt their presence now, not as a demand for expression, but as a steady pressure beneath the habit. A reminder that something was being managed, not shared. The turning didn't happen all at once. There was no declaration, no dramatic shift in behavior. It happened in moments so small they could have gone unnoticed. A sentence she didn't soften, an explanation she started and then let drop. A silence she allowed to remain without rushing to fill it. Each moment left her slightly unsettled. Not because something went wrong, but because she didn't rush to fix the feeling. She noticed how often she had equated discomfort with danger, how quickly she moved to resolve any tension, even internal tension, as if leaving it unresolved would lead to rupture. Now she was beginning to sit with it just long enough to see that discomfort did not automatically mean harm. This sitting was unfamiliar. It felt exposed. There was no script for it, no role she could step into that would guarantee approval. Being good had always given her a script. Without it, even briefly, she wasn't sure who she was expected to be. She realized that much of her behavior had been shaped by anticipation of reaction, anticipation of misunderstanding, anticipation of disappointment. This anticipation had kept her alert, adaptable, responsive, but it had also kept her slightly ahead of herself, never quite landing fully in her own experience. The turning of the habit was not about rejecting anticipation. It was about noticing when anticipation replaced presence. She felt this difference when she chose not to explain something that would have been easy to justify. The silence that followed was not empty. It was charged, not with conflict, but with uncertainty. She didn't know how she was being perceived in that moment. That uncertainty had always been something she avoided. Now she let it linger. She didn't feel powerful doing this. She didn't feel brave. She felt awkward, slightly off balance, like someone learning to walk without leaning on the familiar wall. There was grief in this turning, though she wouldn't have named it that way. Grief for the ease of the old pattern, for the safety of predictability, for the comfort of knowing exactly how to be received. Being good had offered her that comfort. Letting go of its automatic grip meant stepping into a space where outcomes were less controlled. She wasn't sure she wanted that space, but she could no longer pretend it didn't exist. She noticed how others responded when she didn't adjust immediately. Some didn't notice at all. Some filled the space themselves. Some seemed slightly surprised, then moved on. The reactions were far less dramatic than she had imagined. This surprised her. She had spent years preparing for reactions that rarely arrived, years managing outcomes that were mostly neutral, years carrying responsibility that was never explicitly assigned. This realization didn't free her. It complicated things. If the consequences of not adjusting were smaller than she had assumed, then the habit had been serving a purpose beyond prevention. It had been shaping her sense of who she was. Being good wasn't just something she did. It was something she relied on to feel oriented in the world. Without it, even partially, she felt unmoored. The turning of the habit was not a clean break. It was a slow shift in weight, a gradual redistribution of attention, a growing capacity to notice when she moved toward others at the expense of herself. She began to sense the difference between generosity and disappearance, between care and erasure, between peace that included her and peace that required her to step aside. These distinctions didn't come with instructions. They came with discomfort. She felt the urge to return to what was familiar, to smooth things over, to explain herself back into alignment. Sometimes she did, sometimes she didn't. There was no consistency yet. No new pattern had formed, just a loosening of the old one. She realized that the habit had always promised safety, but at the cost of her own edges. Those edges were not sharp. They were simply hers. Allowing them to exist felt risky, not because they would harm others, but because they might change how she was known. Being known differently felt like a loss she hadn't prepared for. The turning did not resolve this tension. It made it visible. She carried that visibility with her now, into conversations, into decisions, into the quiet moments when she was alone and could feel the residue of her day settle around her. The habit still lived in her. It likely always would. It had shaped her too deeply to disappear. But now it was no longer the only force in the room. And that changed everything, even if nothing looked different yet. She went to sleep that night with the sense that something had shifted beneath the surface of her life. Not a conclusion, not a breakthrough. A reorientation, the kind that doesn't announce itself, the kind that simply waits to be lived. Living with the question. There was no moment where it all came together. No final scene where everything made sense. Life didn't pause to let her sort herself out. She still woke up to the same responsibilities, the same relationships, the same expectations. The world hadn't changed because she had noticed something. What had changed was how she occupied herself within it. The question stayed with her, not loudly, not insistently. It didn't demand an answer. It simply followed her like a shadow cast by a light she hadn't known was there. If I stop explaining myself, Who am I to the people I love? She didn't ask this question to solve it. She asked it because it was already present, shaping her choices, whether she acknowledged it or not. There were days when she slipped back into old patterns without noticing. Days when being good felt easier than being present. Days when adjustment came so naturally she forgot there was another way. And then there were moments when she felt the difference, when she stayed quiet a little longer, when she let a boundary stand without cushioning it, when she resisted the urge to manage someone else's reaction. These moments didn't feel triumphant. They felt steady, grounded, real. She didn't become colder. She didn't stop caring. She didn't withdraw from the people in her life. What changed was more subtle. She began to take up space without announcing it. Not space in the room, space inside herself. She noticed when she was acting out of habit versus choice, when she was maintaining peace versus participating in it, when she was being kind versus being compliant. These distinctions didn't make her life simpler. They made it more honest. She no longer expected herself to be understood at all times. She no longer rushed to correct every possible misinterpretation. She let some things remain unfinished, unexplained, unresolved. This unsettled her, and yet it also steadied her. There was a sense of standing on her own feet, not dramatically, not defiantly, but quietly, as if she had stopped leaning in one direction out of habit and discovered that she could stand upright without effort. She didn't abandon the parts of herself that knew how to care, how to anticipate, how to be thoughtful. Those parts were still there. They were part of her history, part of her skill. What changed was that they were no longer the only voice she listened to. There was now another presence inside her, not louder, just steadier. A sense of alignment that didn't depend on approval or explanation. She didn't call this presence anything. Naming it would have made it feel fixed, and it wasn't. It was something she returned to again and again imperfectly. The story didn't end with clarity. It ended with capacity. The capacity to notice when she was disappearing. The capacity to stay when things felt slightly uncomfortable. The capacity to let her choices exist without immediate justification. This capacity didn't guarantee peace. It didn't promise ease. It didn't solve her relationships. What it offered was something quieter, a sense that she no longer had to negotiate herself out of existence to remain connected. She could still be good, still be kind, still be loving. But now, those qualities belonged to her, not the other way around. The question remained open. It would likely always remain open. And for the first time, that didn't feel like a problem. It felt like a place she could stand.